great pleasure to be here. I would say the title is a mouthful, perhaps inappropriate for the Institute for Work and Health. But here's why I still sort of stuck to my guns and said, actually, when I was invited, I said, no, actually, my message to you is actually we've got to sort of think a little bit more broadly about evaluation. Far too often, and this is when I started off my career in evaluation about 2 decades ago, I had a very strong statistical background. I had a few incidents working in a top-notch place in Washington, D.C., where the report was due next afternoon at 5 o'clock or so. I was yanked out of an elevator at 5:30 to say, we've got to run a bunch of models, and we don't quite know what to do, etc. And I just thought, wait a minute, there's some far too often in my own introduction to evaluation came through methods and design. But I sort of, as I began working more and more, I sort of realized the kinds of questions we were asking were much broader than simply questions of methods and design. I'm glad my friend Tim Warren is here from Scotland. A lot of my work was some of these ideas that I'm sharing with you were developed at the University of Edinburgh a few years ago. In fact, Tim and me butted heads a lot about how should we evaluate some of this stuff. So it's sort of great to talk more about it. But the single biggest message I hope to send is that evaluation as a field itself is growing. There are some rather wild and crazy things happening in China and India, for example, if I get to. So the basic rule of the game is I'll wrap it up by 11:45 or so, and move on.
And would you like questions as you go, or would you? Sometimes what we do is have clarification questions as you present.
Yes,
and
but
then
if I'm on a roll, I will ignore the question. So it depends. It depends is going to be the message for today. Yeah? Basically, a little bit of reflection. What's evaluation? And again, even that turns out to be easily we could fill in 45 minutes. This is sort of central to us because I think I actually have no patience with people who sort of say, well, I wrote a fantastic report and it wasn't read. And I like to say, well, tell me what did you do to make your evaluations matter? Did you write? Often we define our job as writing fantastic reports. It's not a miracle. It's no wonder that often is not read. And I think part of the discussion, Tim was heading the Health Equities Group in Scotland. A lot of our work has really, we've continued our dialogue 3 to 4 years after some of the work was done. I just want to give you a little bit of a taste of cutting-edge issues, and part of my job as director of the Evaluation Center for Complex Health Interventions is to be an evangelist for evaluation. I like, in my position in Health Policy Management Evaluation at the University of Toronto, I want more and more students to sort of think about how difficult and why thinking about performance turns out to be a very hard problem, and I think there are tons of dissertations to be written. A little bit of that, but also I want to give you a sense about capacity building. And again, I have calling it teaching evaluations, but I think what I also want you to sort of think about is we appreciate for problems like health equities, problems like self-management, problems like a range of different things, including problems of work and health, we know fully well that it's not a single project that's going to hit a home run. Health equities makes the point rather well for me. Yet we run from one project to another. We do a project, we write the report, and often say, well, no impacts were found on health equities, let's move on to the next project. Very rarely do we actually have a sort of relationship where the actual working on a project helps build the capacity of the very organizations you're evaluating. So I think part of I see a lot of the field moving in that direction. Just to be clear with you, about 6-7 years ago, this whole idea of capacity building was quite nebulous, quite unattractive. More and more, I see a lot of energy happening in this field. And again, a big question is how do you evaluate while simultaneously building capacity? Okay? Again, a little bit of evaluation learning framework and pathways of influence. I would guarantee you will not be done by 11:45, but I think for the time being, at least I think these ideas would be still helpful. So again, this is from the Treasury Board of Canada. By the way, this is for those of you who work with the federal government. There's some pretty exciting movements. I mean, don't underestimate what the Treasury Board of Canada has been doing. They're actually going through reflections on performance in a way that I've been rather surprised. Every 6 months, there are huge symposiums on how best should we think about this issue and that issue. I'm a partisan of this issue. I've been actually amazed at the level of dialogue. So again, all this cliches about the damn federal government, etc., I don't buy that. I think there's some interesting movements happening. So evaluation is defined both as a means of assessing performance and to identify alternative ways to deliver. Sounds fair, sounds good. But I want you to sort of appreciate the fact, at least as far as I'm concerned, even that definition, as good as it may be, is a little incomplete. And here's what I'm trying to get at this. The surprise for me was after my graduate school, when I actually got into working in evaluation at the Urban Institute and a bunch of other top-notch places in the US. The real shock for me was when I went in, talked to the programs, and I'd ask the most obvious question like, so tell me, how is this program going to bring about change? There was a time when I did a very large evaluation, a $40 million evaluation, as part of a team that was following 10,000 children and parents over time, studying the impacts of a media campaign on a range of children outcomes. If you ask people implementing the program, tell me what's the relationship between your program activities and the promised land of outcomes. I was somewhat surprised to see sometimes there would be a black hole. So actually, we don't quite know. You work with community groups, so this is where some of the engagement I had with Tim. But you're doing ambitious interventions in the community. And you want magic to happen. Health equities to reduce, community health to improve, etc., etc. And I was trained in measurement and design, strong background. But the interesting thing was, all of that was, in my view, secondary to the knowledge translation problem on how on earth are you going to bring about the change between what you're trying to do and your outcomes. And the rather remarkable thing was, I wasn't trained to have that dialogue, but I had gotten frustrated after almost 10 years of doing evaluation, focused purely on methods and design. That asking the more obvious question about, so why aren't you doing A, B, and C? I thought there was a bit of a hole, and this is where part of the Scottish experience was really sort of saying, actually, it's well within the remit of evaluation to raise those kinds of questions. And now that I'm a part of a bunch of capacity-building experiments called Worldwide, I'm trying to introduce that thinking into the curriculum of evaluation, so that I think we think a little more broadly about evaluation. So this should be very familiar to Tim. This was the example that really sort of got me thinking about some of these issues. I'll give you the quick 1-minute version of the story. I won't do justice to it. The focus is health equities. Huge problem. We spent the morning, Tim and me, talking to my team about the problems of health equities in Scotland. The focus was on identifying and reaching the poor areas of Scotland. So the focus was poor areas of Scotland. Their hope was by targeting poor areas, you would get poor people, then go through a bunch of different interventions. I won't describe this in any detail. The hope was that these interventions will lead to an improvement in lifestyle, reductions in CHD risk, which over time would lead to a reduction in health inequalities. Now, interesting sort of program theory, made a lot of sense. When I first read it, of course, focusing on poor areas, 15% of the poor areas, made a great deal of sense. Now here's an actual experiment, actual event that happened, and I'm not looking at Tim out here. We had a new program manager who took over the position, and this is where Tim and me got into some debates.
I was wrong.
She calls me up. This is very interesting. She calls me up and she says, actually, we spent a lot of resources trying to reach 15% of our poorest people. This is basically Scotland, one of the poorer areas of Scotland. And Tim will tell you the full details. But here's the question she raises with me. She says, we're not getting the poorest people. We're actually getting the better offs. And this is no surprise to all of you. So she asks, and here's the evaluative question she asks. She says, we cannot be investing in the Rolls-Royce version of the treatment, all of the stuff, to this group. Because remember, the promised land is over here. And you're not going to get there if you're getting this step wrong. To her great credit, she was asking me, what should we do? Should we wait for another 3 years for the great evaluator to say, sorry, no impacts on health inequalities? Or think logically about it. Say, actually, we've got a problem. We've got to think more dynamically about our interventions. Should we improve the intervention over here to reach the poorest people? And my answer, and this is again me with a very traditional view of evaluation, etc. I said, don't ask me. I'm the evaluator. Okay? That's a Scottish government problem, etc., etc. I was wrong, completely, because it would not have taken me more than 5 minutes to pick up the phone and say, actually, this is a fantastic question. And she was right. She was sort of asking the question, why should we continue giving the Rolls-Royce version should we give a slightly reduced level of it so that you could actually get this box right? I want you to reflect on this example as you think about work and health issues. I know this is not a problem that may not be directly connected to you. But I want you to think about, far too often we as evaluators are trained to say, hey, I promised to do A, B, and C. That was the blueprint we agreed upon. We have a contract that backs me up. That's what I'm going to do. And when you are actually faced with trying to work on a complex problem like this question is more the norm rather than the exception. She was actually following, she was being responsible. I would say a majority of project managers would not have raised that question. They would have waited for a few years for the report to produce the predictable results. Did not impact health inequalities. Worse still, it exacerbated health inequalities because the better offs went through the system. So I want you to start thinking about, it's actually a pretty difficult problem. And this is where some version of an integrated evaluation knowledge translation is needed. Okay? And this is again where the evaluator is not sort of hidden away somewhere. We are part of an active dialogue in trying to make this happen. Okay? So that's the background. And what am I doing at time? So what I want you to start thinking about, and I'll come back to this example. I hope to sort of give Tim a few minutes to sort of reflect towards the end too. I'm taking a step back. Why evaluate? I think the central biggest problem in some of the debates about evaluation is not a lack of understanding, but the very different kinds of evaluations. One kind of evaluation focuses on assessing merit and worth of programs. So have a heart Paisley, was it a great thing? Did it make a difference to people's lives? That's why we can get into a whole bunch of debates on what's the best way to evaluate the impacts causally. And the evaluation literature is very rich on that sort of debates. But very often, as evaluators, you call them to say, help us with program improvement. We've got a broad sense on how to address health inequalities. But the reality is, once you look at the evidence base, once you try to introduce programs in communities, we don't quite know. There is uncertainty. I've got to be honest and say, there isn't as much reflection on the types of uncertainties in the evidence when we go through implementation programs, because 9 times out of 10, I'm a little surprised that actually we don't really know as much as we think we do. Okay, so very often, evaluations end up doing more of the stuff than I thought I would be focusing on. Oversight and compliance, so again, smoking ban in Scotland, it's not going to work if the bars were not strict about implementing the smoking ban. Okay, that's a much more sort of audit kind of function. I want you to reflect on the knowledge development part. And again, I sort of see this huge debate about is evaluation, research, etc., etc. I find that some of it is a little silly. But the broader point I'm making is the fact that for me, there's not a single evaluation that does not provide you an opportunity to learn about the kinds of programs you need in the first place. So again, this idea of what do we need to know in the first place to make a difference in people's lives, evaluation provides fantastic opportunities. So again, I think this idea of knowledge development itself is a goal of evaluation. Often gets forgotten. Okay. So, as we sort of start moving towards complex interventions, etc., etc., this is my friend Ray Posson. I bet he came up with a discussion on Wheeler synthesis, talking about complex interventions. And the first time I saw this, it sounded too academic to me. More and more, even in the most practical situation, I actually sort of reflect on these issues. I'll just mention a few bullets, just to sort of say this is actually more meaningful and practical than it sounds. The first one is that intervention is a theory or theories. Again, I want to say this a little bit about my own academic background. I did my best to stay away from theories as far as possible. I thought the whole idea of, in my graduate school courses, I took 16 out of those 18 courses were on methods and design. I thought I could duck the theory part. But more and more, I sort of realized almost every intervention is based on some theory. And I'll be more precise in a second, but go back to have a heart Paisley. If I had more time, I'd sort of show you at every single step, there's a comment along the lines of, if you do this, then you hope that this will happen. If that happens, then this will happen. It's a series of if-then statements. If I target the poorest areas, I'm going to get the poorest people. That's an assumption. So a fundamental goal of an evaluation is to make such assumptions explicit. So really, one of the learnings of Have a Heart Paisley was, is this broader policy that focuses on 15% of the poorest areas good enough? Okay. I like the second bullet, and this again I think connects to work and health. Far too often we have a view of evaluation that says, actually, if you do A, B, and C, D, E, and F will happen. The challenge for some of the interventions I work on is people matter. A project manager who has passion, who is really concerned about making a difference in people's lives, or a doctor who's concerned about, I've got to do something about this, but to a teacher who wants to make a difference, all matter. And you cannot reduce that to say, follow prescription A, B, and C. People matter in our story. So very often you'll hear in community interventions, well, the director left the program, and since then the program went south. That's why, because our interventions are not purely, here's a drug, take it. The third bullet is also important. Very rarely is the argument along the lines, take this drug, magic will happen. A will lead to a reduction in headache. Right. It's a series of different steps that need to happen. I won't go too much into this, but I want to stress this point. In our own evaluation methodologies, we're often assumed that our interventions are stable. Our interventions don't change over time. But what I want you to reflect on is, go back to the phone call I received from the project manager of Have a Heart Paisley. What she was doing was a great example of learning. She was being responsible. She was saying, actually, our view of who was going to come was wrong. Part of our experiment is we need to tinker with the intervention, because what we are learning is the right kind of bloke is not coming through the door. So the question is, as an evaluation community, we have not fully, in my view, reflected on what do these changes and this evolutionary interventions mean for evaluation design. Okay, so on and so forth. I won't go too much into it, but again, we could spend a day on this stuff. That's the realist literature. Then you have the system dynamics group coming out of MIT and a bunch of other places coming from a business literature, where they're again making very similar points. Again, this constantly changing bit is important. Whether it's constantly changing or changing once in a while, it doesn't matter. The point is, how does the evaluation respond to these issues? Non-linear, adaptive, etc. I think characterized by trade-offs again is important, because very rarely in a program can you actually achieve it all. You've got to make those kinds of decisions in an adaptive way over time. I want to stress on the last bullet. And this is important because evaluators, far too often, we are focused on, well, great things happen. We don't focus on programs being embedded in systems, and guess what? The systems might strike back. So I like this idea. It's disturbance writing. Policy resistance, the result is policy resistance, and the tendency for interventions to be defeated by the system's response to the intervention itself. So far too often we are sort of trained, so well, here's an intervention, we expect health inequalities to be impacted, A, B, C, and D. What happened? Yes or no? We don't pay as much attention to what actually happened to the broader system in which this intervention is embedded. A couple of cartoons that make the point. So firstly, just remember, and I like, when I start off an evaluation, I like asking, just to get people to think a little bit differently. I like sort of saying, well, tell me, what's the bad stuff that can actually happen? Because far too often we assume good intentions will translate into great differences in outcomes. I would not describe this. I like this slide too, because again it makes the comment about systems. Here's a man sitting in a cubicle, I think, decides that he's feeling a little claustrophobic. Turns out it's not a good idea. So the point I'm making is, far too often we focus on this action. We don't focus on the broader system. We don't think dynamically about it. And again, I don't have great answers, but I'm sort of part of a community that's sort of trying to raise questions about what does all of this mean, methodologically, etc. So, again, keeping an eye on the time. So I like asking, if we had a full day, etc., and this is how I start a workshop, etc., I love talking to policymakers, practitioners, and academics. Can you describe a few evaluations that have been useful? Turns out to be a harder question than it sounds. People actually have a pretty hard time saying, this is an evaluation that was actually useful for my work. People often say, well, there was a fantastic evaluation I read, great design, etc., etc. I get those kinds of answers. But actually an evaluation that actually made a difference, that's a problem. Turns out the United Nations Internal Oversight Services wrote a fantastic report. It's on the web. That's the that's the subtext to the title. Results-based management of the UN has been an administrative chore of little value to accountability and decision-making. I use it because I think far too often we do evaluations because we have to, not because we want to, not because we get clear about what we want to learn, etc. There's a tremendous report, and it makes the following points. It's well worth reflecting on it. I won't go through all of the points, but I like the first point. Far too often, evaluations are done, this is the comment I make to the Treasury Board of Canada, where one of the critiques I have of that is they basically say, evaluate everything. If you take money out of the federal, you've got to evaluate it. I think that's silly. You've got to have a broader strategy. You should be evaluating in a strategic kind of way. If you evaluate everything, that's like evaluating nothing. But the other comment here is we often, we've invested in this project, that project, that project. So again, Institute of Work and Health, all these different programs we're doing. I think before you jump into doing project level evaluations, ask yourself, what's the broader strategy? What do we hope to learn across these different programs, etc., etc. And that's where, again, I think the Scottish experience was very helpful. Not because the commissioning mechanism was not simply, Sanjeev got a bid for this. Once we got into Haverhart Paisley, we had a seat on the table to discuss what are the learnings across a range of different policies, even to this day, a few years after that. I think the focus on measurement, which is completely fair, but often we end up measuring outputs, not measuring what might actually matter. I won't go through all of this, but I think the last bullet is actually more important than it sounds. Not at all clear why are you doing this evaluation. Okay, again, to the extent as evaluators we train people to say, actually, let's be clear about what needs to be learned, etc., etc. Okay, again, there's a view that sort of says, well, most of evaluation is either of this type or that type. Does it work? Or process evaluation. I don't think we've been as good about saying, actually, it's a range of different questions, and we've got to go through a process of prioritization. A couple of other points. I'm going to talk about the second bullet here. Far too often, we've been trained in terms of saying, well, we need to run a multi-level model instead of a standard regression. That's often the debates we have, the discussions we have. We need to do an RCT instead of an observation study. I don't think we paid as much attention to issues of capacity. Saying, actually, for Paisley to impact health inequalities, for west of Glasgow to impact health inequalities, it's not about doing a cool evaluation project for the University of Edinburgh for 3 years. What are you doing to build capacity for these projects? So far too often we have treated evaluation as methodological problems, not as capacity problems. And more in the work we are doing in the Evaluation Centre, we love it when people who are actually implementing programs, so we actually have a session on Thursday, which is full. We actually had about 120 seats, more than 200 people want to come along, a majority of them implementing programs. Now this is great, because our message is evaluation is not just for evaluators. Okay? You've got to think evaluating as you implement programs, just as the project manager for Haverhart Paisley was doing. I want to talk about the last one, and I think I go back to my elevator during my Washington, D.C. days, where I was yanked out and said, you know how to run multi-level models, can you help us with this? And my question to the principal investigator at that point was, tell me, what's your program theory? What should go into the model? And the project director said, well, you are the statistician. You've got to figure that out. I thought that was extraordinary. Wait a minute. You've been working with this project for a long time. I've just known about this in the last 10 minutes. You've sort of assumed that because I have a statistical background, I would know how to answer these questions. I can go on, but I think there's a certain view that technical solutions are the answer. And again, this is how I was trained, this is how I make a living. But I have to confess that most of it is about common sense, about thinking evaluatively about problems, and trying to move away from let's do cool methods. Cool methods matter, but it's one of many things that matter. Okay. So again, a couple of comments on evidence, and this sort of really connects well with your comment on realist synthesis. Again, go back to Haverhart Paisley. The other thing that I've seen, that I find myself thinking about, reflecting, debating, dialoguing, is often, like Haverhart Paisley, the focus was on heart disease. So one way to think about evidence is you look at similar kinds of community interventions, focus on heart disease across multiple communities. You look at evaluations, and you figure out a way to do what's the average effect, etc., etc. Well, actually, there's a good chance Haverhart Paisley is going to work. My experience working with Paisley and a couple of other communities is often this itself does not provide great clarity on what actually needs to happen in interventions. So let me plug realist synthesis for a second. Another way of thinking about it is actually this idea that a community intervention doesn't make a lot of sense. There are many different parts to this intervention. So Haberhart-Paisley, important parts included reach, screening, health coaching. The focus then becomes not so much what's the best evidence in terms of reach for heart disease, but what can we steal from a range of different studies, including studies focused on heart disease, but maybe studies from cancer, studies from education, studies from crime, on how do you reach the poorest people. So on and so forth. Screening, go through a process where you synthesize it, and hopefully this will lead towards a modified program. This appeals to me, and this is part of the work we are sort of doing, in terms of trying to move away from a best buy view of evidence towards saying, actually, these different components, this is what we know, we're pretty uncertain about these kinds of questions, etc. Okay. So, part of what we've been doing is sort of saying, well, all of this done, still good on time, how do we, these are sort of broad set of ideas, how do we sort of take a more practical approach towards making evaluations matter? And I wrote a paper that Linda was referring to in terms of 10 steps to making evaluations matter. I go through reflecting on these steps for every single evaluation I do. I want to stress this. Very often, I would only be able to, in an actual evaluation, I may actually be able to do only 3 or 4 or 5 of the steps. That's not the point. The point I'm making is these are issues that I reflect on, and depending on different contingencies, we'll sort of go ahead. Number one, very critical. Before I can actually say, does a program work, etc., I like to reflect on, tell me a little bit about the program. Are the components of your program stable? So Haberhart-Paisley, for the primary prevention example, every time I went back to Paisley, they had a different idea on how to do one component of an intervention. Now that has implications for the evaluation design. So step number one is simply get an idea on what the key components are. If you email me, I'll send you the paper. Step number two is what we're calling the program theory, but is there clarity on what's the connection between program activities, your short-term and long-term outcomes? As I've already argued, surprisingly, in many number of cases, there's not this kind of clarity. Okay? And this is not what I was trained to do whatsoever. But more and more before I rush into measurement, this becomes important. That's 2. 3, as I've just made a plug for realist synthesis, but again, very often I see programs sort of needing help at the early stages. Just to be clear, I'm not arguing the evaluator has to do this all. There's meant to be a collaborative dialogue. Some of the steps are better done by others. But I raise these questions. The 4th is actually quite important, especially for some of the complex interventions I've worked on and I'm working on right now. It turns out to be quite critical. Far too often, we'll come in and say, let's implement this intervention, and we've got an evaluation budget for 2 years. Let's see if miracles happen in 2 years. We don't pay attention to change something like health inequalities. It would be a miracle if change happens in 2 years. So more and more I like reflecting, talking to stakeholders on, tell me, how long do you think this intervention can actually impact the following kinds of outcomes? And people provide surprisingly detailed answers, etc., etc. And again, people will vary. For smoking ban, people said actually 6 to 8 months, we think we're going to see some changes. For other kinds of community interventions, people have said actually 7 to 10 years. This I find important because success is defined based on expectations. If people actually expect changes in 6, 7 years, and your evaluation runs for 2 years, how useful is that statement at the end of an evaluation that says no evidence was found after a 2-year evaluation? I think you need to be more explicit about that. But it turns out in international development, a field I work in a fair bit these days, there's a rich literature growing on this itself. So those are some issues I've sort of focused on in terms of intervention theory. Well, this is slightly nebulous. I'll just talk with the second bullet. Before again I rush into an evaluation, I like getting clarity on what are the evaluation questions. It turns out, most evaluations cannot answer more than a few questions well. Different stakeholders have very different kinds of questions. I actually spent some time trying to debate it, trying to say, actually, cannot answer those 16 questions. We can answer the following 6 questions properly within the following budget, within the following time. That turns out to be a useful example. The first bullet, some of the work we're doing on quality improvement. Very critical that the evaluation itself is explicit on how will the evaluation, how will the information from the evaluation itself make a difference to the program. More about this later if you have time. But this comes, 7 and 8 comes to what I was trained to do. Number 7 especially. So what's the impact of the evaluation, of the intervention? And this is where traditional notions of design I find incredibly helpful. Cook and Campbell stuff, for those who follow evaluation literature, is incredibly helpful. surprisingly few evaluators are trained in issues of design. Often there'll be people mouthing off, well, this is the better design than the others. When you sort of grill a little bit further, to talk to us about hidden biases, talk to us about threats to internal validity, external validity, our vocabularies are not good enough, even on that step. Eighth, even in this embracing of program theory, one should not take it in a more static sense. How do you build in a methodology that allows you to learn over time? Even in the best evaluation literature, often the focus is, well, on day one, here was the program theory. We don't go back and say, actually, this is what we learned about Haberhart-Paisley after a few years. Okay. Ninth and 10th, again, I raise these issues because often the assumption is ninth spread. So more and more, if I work with the Scottish Government, for example, I like asking the question. I ask this question in the first month. Let's say we find that Haberhart-Paisley worked. It hits a home run on all the following kinds of outcomes. What are you trying to spread here? Are you trying to spread Haberhart-Paisley all across Scotland? And that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because if you don't have the resources to support Haberhart-Paisley within Paisley for the next few years, how are you going to spread it all across Scotland? What's the level of spread here? And I find that an engaging question, not because it produces clear answers, it just creates a learning frame for the evaluation. Further, I think more and more, and these are 9 and 10 are not really clean answers, but when I'm fresh out of graduate school, I thought we were entering a world in which do an evaluation, and then based on the evaluation, people decide, let's sustain the program, yes or no. More and more, I think it doesn't happen. Two is I'm actually arguing it shouldn't happen, because programs are dynamic entities. It's not a thumbs up or a thumbs down view. But I think reflecting on what's the role of the evaluation for sustainability, I think we need to do it in a much more aggressive kind of way. We'll go on for another 5 minutes. So again, I think based on this, again, the kinds of questions I would raise, going back to Haberhart-Paisley, are questions on what basis do we sustain the program? What are the key learnings from the evaluation? What gets spread as a result of the evaluation? And this was tremendous, because when Haberhart-Paisley was happening, within a year into Haberhart-Paisley, the successor programs, there was a change of government, the Labour Party skipped out and the Scottish Nationalist Party came back. They decided to push ahead with the successor set of programs. So initially, I found a complete lack of interest in Haberhart-Paisley results. But the moment I began reflecting on what are the lessons from Haberhart-Paisley to keep well and other strategies, there really was a great appetite for these kinds of things. So again, aligning your results with the broader policy landscape becomes incredibly important. So again, I find this helpful. Actually, Tim and me, Tim, you may not remember this, developed this a few years ago in Edinburgh. But the basic idea, as I sort of learned from the Haberhart-Paisley experience, this was sort of my evolving view of where evaluation sits. There's a policy landscape. So in Scotland, great focus on health inequalities. The idea was some people were tasked, based on the best evidence, based on some ideas and theory, come up with some notions of programs. And somebody came and spent a lot of time designing Haberhart-Paisley. In fact, a good exercise out of today is actually to go back to read some of your some of the plans for the interventions you've been a part of. You'd be amazed at how few plans are actually implementable. Okay? So Haberhart-Paisley, go back and read it. I was really surprised. I thought, well, once you know the plan, you know how to implement it. Turns out, no, there's a lot of ambiguity. The pathways by which Haberhart-Paisley works was quite unclear. There was an evidence base, but there was a lot of areas of uncertainty. Part of our job as evaluator was to make this explicit. Okay, again, I've got to say, I'd love to get down to the methods and design part of it as quickly as possible, but I found it hard to do if this part was not clear. Okay. Then comes the more traditional notions of evaluation, where, again, a part of what I'm arguing for is there's a different kind of learning, different sets of learning. There could be learning about individual impacts that make a difference to people's lives. There could be a policy impact. How did doing the evaluation make a difference to thinking about these kinds of interventions? Organizational learning. What have you learned about implementing such kinds of programs? Process learning. I can choose a better word than risk landscape, but very interesting. A lot of interventions are planned without clarity on the lives that people lead. So Haberhart-Paisley, folks weren't clear whether they should have the health coaching sessions at 3 o'clock in the afternoon or at 6 o'clock in the evening. You are making assumptions of what numbers are unemployed, etc., in making those kinds of judgments. So often programs fail not because they're bad ideas, but you've not paid attention to the constraints of people's lives. I feel evaluation provides a chance to bring that kind of learning. But this is important. It's not a series of reports that hit the home run. You have to align with the changing landscape. So Haverhart Paisley, this was a no-show. Nobody was interested if I did not align with the changes in between Haverhart Paisley and Keep Well. And I got invited to a table where people were sort of saying, actually, now how should we think about Keep Well, etc., etc. And that turns out to be very critical. Well, I won't go into all of this, but the idea is it takes a while for an evaluation to actually have those kinds of impacts, but this step becomes super critical. I'll wrap it up in 2 minutes. Is that all right? Linda, am I okay on time? Mm-hmm. Okay. So all of this is fine. I won't describe the slide, but this is for my graduate class. I sort of use this slide to sort of say, these, I think, are a class of 9 problems that if we were doing a PhD in evaluation, these are some of the areas. Each of these boxes can be inhabited quite deeply, but turns out very sort of elementary issues in terms of making judgments about changing the world. I think there's still a lot of debate to be had, etc., etc. I won't discuss that. I'll end with the following slide. Very interesting. I'll 4 years ago, or maybe 5 years ago, the United Nations Children's Fund in South Asia, originally based in Kathmandu, I think they moved their offices now to Bangkok. They said, we're a little tired of the usual evaluations where we have like the experts coming down from Toronto and Edinburgh and all that kind of stuff too. They write the evaluation report, not really sure what happens after that, etc., etc. That stuff doesn't improve the capacity for folks in South Asia to actually do their own evaluation. So they came up with a rather bold idea. So let's actually develop a master's in evaluation that cuts across multiple South Asian countries. The countries were Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, Afghanistan, and Sri Lanka. So, incredible range of countries. A lot of the countries not very good friends, etc., etc. But I said, actually, let's actually develop a joint master's in evaluation. So I was part of a team in the last couple of years that actually sort of talked about what kinds of courses do we train people in terms of thinking about evaluation. I know that's not a question that's necessarily relevant to all of you, but the broader issue is really what are skills that evaluators need to have. I know when I was trained in graduate school, I thought, well, if you know your design, you know your methods, qualitative and quantitative, get on with things. I think that's not enough. In my own evaluation center, hiring evaluators is a pretty hard problem. It's finding the right set of skill sets become quite tricky. But these are not my ideas, this is what the team came up with. One was an introduction to evaluation along the lines of these were the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8 courses that I came up with. But again, what is evaluation, etc.? A little more sort of gentle introduction. 2, evaluation approaches. And again, as a field, there's a tremendous amount of diversity. And again, as a field itself, the evaluation field has not done a good enough job of sort of reconciling different views. Again, that's work for the future. 3, I'm very traditional. When it comes to design, I think getting people trained in quasi-experiments and experiments become critical. Not because you want to slavishly follow that up, because you need to know the basics. Okay? Far too few evaluators know this stuff. Qualitative and quantitative methods, ethics and standards, especially in regions like South Asia. Again, very few of us actually trained in thinking about both the ethics of the intervention as well as the ethics of evaluation. The last 2 actually turned out to be very, very critical. Again, communication, a very, very critical skill to have. I think so much of evaluation is not the evaluation report, but this process of constant influence, etc. That's an important skill. At least I was glad to see the South Asians sort of think along those lines. What was rather beautiful was the folks from it was the Ibasina School of Public Health in Afghanistan who designed this. So different universities were designing different modules. So it was a truly co-developed module. The Afghanis developed the communication module. It's phenomenal. Not being taped, but the comment I want to make was country. I won't say it's fully, but the countries you'd think would be the leaders of that were not the leaders. It was countries like Afghanistan who were sort of really leading that. Again, managing evaluation. So I'll leave you with this thought that really, as you sort of think about whether it's an evaluation program at the academic level or training people to sort of think evaluatively for work and health, what are the skills you think are relevant? Those are the kind of things we try to raise in our center. I'll stop here.
So thank you very much. Lots of food for thought. We have about 15 minutes for questions, and I should let you know that we are being recorded so that we can post the plenary on the website. So you can find the slides there as well if there's any citations you missed. And so I saw Sheila had her hand up.
In the Have a Heart Paisley, how were you trying to identify the poorest of the poor, and why didn't it work, and what did you do in the end after the program manager identified that?
Oh, no, as I say, at the end, not a whole lot. So I'll start off with the third question. Not a whole lot. Number one.
So you let the program go.
Yes, go. That's right.
It wasn't his program.
It was not.
Well, that was another question I had, was where the evaluator sat compared to the people running the program.
That's right.
Okay.
Then your first question. I think part of the issue here was there was not a rigorous program design aspect to identifying the poorest of the poor. They were sort of buying into the cliches of poor areas, etc. So as an example, respondent-driven sampling or those kind of things were not necessarily part of the deal here too. But the broader point was there was not a system built into it. So that as we see people coming through the doors, we'll go back and tinker with our reach mechanisms. The way the program was planned was very linear. It said June of 2007 is when the letters go out or when these kinds of activities are going to be done. There was not a system built in that, based on the early responses, we'll sort of say, actually, we'll tinker with our reach activities. That was not part of it itself. And that's what the question she was asking, really. You know?
Okay, and that could have been part of the evaluation.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
But that's right. But again, part of what we're really after is how does the evaluation itself help an integrated knowledge translation in almost real time.
Well, and that was my next question, was where the evaluator sat relative to who was running the program. And there's quite often some value seen in the evaluator being independent and separate. So if you're going to be that, how do you integrate that knowledge?
No, that's right. And that's where, in defense of my own actions at that point, that's how I saw myself. But over time, I sort of realized, and that's how I was trained, by the way, of really kind of saying, so I'm sort of speaking a very different language from what I was trained to do, kind of stuff. But I sort of thought, wait a minute, I'm actually being quite irresponsible, etc. And so part of negotiating that terrain in terms of saying, actually tell us, so in discussions with a major evaluation for the International Development Research Center right now, multiple consortium, that's exactly the question we are raising. Tell us, where do we sit? If we are sitting in a more traditional way, where we're going to fast judgments from a distance of us, let us know that. Turns out, at least for that kind of more traditional, I know how much time that's going to take. Some of the other things where you actually become very integrated. It's not just an issue of role, which is critical. Also, I find myself not doing sometimes a good job in terms of that role if I don't factor in, actually, this is not a two-day job. This is like Paisley, for example. Originally, I thought I was just going to be the external bloke showing up to town. I had budgeted 3 days in my first year to go to Paisley, or I think 6 days or something like that. I had to make 35 trips. Not because I was heroic, but that was part of the process, etc. Tim, why don't you address that question now?
Yeah, I think that Paul Sanji caught in the neck both ways, because he was objective and then caught in the neck for being objective and not engaged, and then he wasn't engaged enough and caught in the neck for giving the wrong answer to the questions. I think with his own judgment, 2020 hindsight, he should have said you needed to sustain the contact with to put most effort into continuing to reach the most deprived, rather than the worried well within that deprived community. I think, I mean, it's, I'm not an evaluator, I'm a policy person in the Scottish Government. And so I remember a little bit about that, and a little bit about that, and a little bit about that. And I'm not unusual as a policy person. As you go on, I think my boss said she learned more and more. No, she knew less and less about more and more. And that's just the nature of the job. And I think that the mental analogy I have is bicycle riding. That if you decide the route you're going to take on a bicycle, and you fix your hands in a fixed position, you start pedaling, and you might get run over by the truck, but you'll certainly fall over pretty quickly. It's constant adaptation and engagement. And I think that there was one, maybe a slide or two back, where you said, I won't talk about that, but there was the more like riding a bike in terms of engaging with the players. And there is a script. There's Sanjeev connected with me as a policy person, made sure that the lessons that were being learned from Habahat Paisley an avenue to be taken up within the new administration and the new set of governors' hopes and aspirations, so that the lessons could be learned and adopted. The fact that he was successful in that is why I'm here. But it's not something where there's a simple scripted answer.
Okay.
Hugely adaptive as you go.
Any other questions?
You have another. You use the Paisley example a lot of maybe something that wasn't as successful because of the way the evaluation wasn't woven into the program. But is there another one where you had take those learnings from that experience to where it has worked to make an impact?
I'd love to say I have many, but the answer is. But I'm not going to. It's ongoing. Is the answer to the question. So I'm not going to give you the specific details of it. But it's a large evaluation. So I'll mention two, and I'll do my best to keep it in a way that you don't know what it is. So, one is focused on issues of international development, where the focus is on innovations and does funding research. Does funding innovations huge amounts of money in terms of make a difference to global health. And again, this is ongoing. There are stumbling blocks. 3 years from now, I'm going to tell you. And by the way, just in defense of Harvard basically was not a failure. The fact is, while I'm pointing out there were these points where we flunked, these points we did rather well. It's not a failure at all, as far as I'm concerned. So we just don't reflect on these issues. We get too caught up on the product kind of stuff. So Harvard Paisley actually is one of our more successful cases. The fact that it still lives 4 years after 4 or 5 is important. But for this innovation study, what's been rather amazing is how the funder has structured the evaluation to kind of address these kinds of stoppage points, etc. And these constant phases where we reflect on actually what's the role here, etc. So we actually so it's not a random phone call. We have multiple ways to navigate those kinds of issues. That's one. Two is a study that comes out of the federal government here, where the funding comes to Ontario. Again, focus on a specific sector, but there are 12 different projects. Part of our job is to do a system-level evaluation to help connect the different projects that again have potential. So there are stories, but again, I think going back to what I like about your question, and again, I'm not doing a successful job answering that question, is I started off my career as a civil engineer, and if I have to inspire my kids to be a civil engineer, I sort of show them the golden gate to say, well, actually, look at what civil engineers can do. I think as we build better performance stories, we could have much more exemplars. So actually thinking along these lines, how has that actually made a difference?
I have a question.
Sure.
So sometimes as an evaluator, you find yourself in a situation where you would like to address the question of effectiveness of a program, but the answer to that is potentially threatening to an important stakeholder. Do you have recommendations of how one navigates that difficult situation and that stakeholder could choose to not make that evaluation possible?
I think, firstly, evaluation is a very political act, and I'm going to come to get at the chase kind of stuff. So firstly, I sort of realized that I think if you're doing your job right, chances are not everyone's going to be happy. So I need to remember this kind of stuff because there's not like a great, happy, joyful evaluation where somebody was not upset along the way and stuff. So my first comment to your question is, in any case, if you're, depending on the kinds of interventions you're talking about, the moment you move it simply, Health Canada wants the answer for this, you're just talking about stakeholders, there's a process of prioritization where some questions get left out. That's one area in which people get upset. Your question is much more specific, where you say, well, this kind of stakeholder wants an answer on effectiveness, or does not want an answer on effectiveness, but you think as an evaluator,
or a researcher,
That's
it's
right.
worth asking.
So that's right. So for me, a couple of points. Firstly, my own experience, say, working on community intervention. So I'm sort of thinking of, as I try to answer your question, the cases in which folks have tried to actually hold off on the effectiveness question. To be fair to that view, so and I sort of, part of the implication is somebody feeling too threatened, part of what you said, actually, not the implication. So in the scenarios where I've actually given the stakeholder the due is sometimes people have said, actually, you know what, we still don't have our act together in terms of interventions. We're still figuring things out. For a community, so I'm thinking of a community intervention in the U.S. where the focus was on juvenile violent crime at a community level. The funder wanted to move towards effectiveness. People in the community said, actually, 2 years, we don't think so. This is why I got into timeline of impact work. So my first practical answer is reflecting, actually, let's actually have a stakeholder discussion. How long will this change take? That's one. Two is, again, a discussion around sustainability, where what I've actually found in most places, once you sort of move beyond, I've got a big stick and I'm going to hit you with this evaluation thing, it's a view of the world, I actually find even the most resistant stakeholders not wanting to waste time. Nobody wants to be part. So this is my view. It does pay the bills, but once you go beyond all of that, people want to be a part of a change process. So the kind of helpful guide I find is really, once you catch people in this space to actually say, well, what will it take to bring about change? Often people are resistant to the program as is being evaluated, but if there's room to say, actually, tinkering may be allowed, etc., there's more room for that. Mm-hmm. But that said, I completely concur there are situations that are so political, including some of the ones I'm working right now, where it's really, I've got to be constantly sort of being explicit that this is going to be, I am going to be a bad news Charlie pretty soon, or good news Charlie, but that's really part of a dynamic discourse that's needed. Those are ramblings, not helpful aids. So
well, I think I heard you say that the effectiveness question can sometimes be negotiated to be deferred, and you can focus on, I guess, other evaluative questions.
But when I say deferred, I want to be careful.
And rightly so.
But at no stage should it be deferred as in it doesn't matter. For example, there's an evaluation I'm doing that's focused on formative issues. Help us make corrective action. I cannot discuss that question without a focus on what's the likelihood of impact right now based on what's happening. Based on what we're finding, then we find that. So when I say defer it, I'm sort of saying defer a thumbs up or a thumbs down view of it, but engage with that question in a very, very serious way.
Looks like we have time for one more question or two quick ones. Monique?
Thank you. That was very, very interesting. When I look at some of my colleagues in the health area, they are not taking this bigger systems approach. Do you find that the movement is slow to do some of this, and the standard RCT is still reigns the day, or are you getting, particularly when I think of interventions related to a particular disease and maybe some self-management, not so much where they're working with government right up front, but working with the healthcare system in a smaller way?
I think it's a uphill. There are battles along the way, but the fact that there was support for an evaluation center for complex health interventions, and I was very clear that I didn't want the evaluation center to be known as the anti-RCT center, for example. That didn't make a lot of sense because I have a very, if it fits this intervention, you should do it. It's unprincipled not to do it, is my view about it. So I didn't want to position it as the anti-gold standard, etc. But on the other hand, part of the argument was really, let's define what's the most rigorous design, or more broadly, what's the best approach, based on needs, etc., etc. Answering your question, yes, there is still a pretty strong clout where if you don't say I love a certain design, etc., you're somehow considered heretical. That's still part of it. But the fact that I still, to this day, I've done a majority of my designs, probably in the RCT category, is helpful in this message itself too. I'm actually quite optimistic about the change itself. So while there definitely are very strong pockets of this is the way to go, etc., I've actually seen a rather remarkable change process happen globally. My comment really is actually I'm pretty convinced that when I see it, what I didn't get to was I was going to show you work we're doing with the Ministry of Health in China, where they're sort of trying to think broadly about their health systems reform. So in that sense, I'm quite increasingly convinced. I've worked in the US, Canada, and the UK. I work a fair bit in Asia these days. I'm increasingly convinced that some of the more exciting movements in evaluation are not coming from UK, Canada, the US. It's from Asia, for example. So my answer is a broader one. That I think we need to kind of the slowness has not been on RCT versus other kinds of designs, but actually thinking in a much more exciting way about what will it take to build our evaluation skills, etc.
Great. Thanks again for your interesting presentation, food for thought. Thank you.